The Nutcracker's Last Waltz. Welcome, dear listeners, to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, your guide through tonight's tale of Christmas tragedy and hidden truths. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. What's your favourite Christmas tradition? Is it the decorations, the carols, or perhaps a special performance you attend each year? Share your memories in the comments below. I always treasure reading about the traditions that warm your hearts during the festive season. Now, settle in with your hot cocoa or mulled wine, and let's step into a world where even the most joyous celebrations can harbour deadly secrets. Chapter 1. Silver Bells and Bitter Almonds. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her fur-trimmed coat against the December chill as she approached the Grand Theatre of St. Mary Mead. The building stood resplendent in its Christmas finery, with garlands of holly and ivy draping the Georgian columns, and hundreds of tiny lights twinkling like captured stars against the evening sky. Tonight's performance of the Nutcracker was the highlight of the village's festive calendar, a charity gala that raised funds for the Pemberton Dance Academy's scholarship program. The theatre lobby buzzed with excited conversation as the cream of local society gathered in their finest evening wear. Miss Marple observed the scene with her characteristic blend of appreciation and careful attention. She noted Mrs. Bantry near the champagne table, engaged in animated discussion with Colonel Melchett, while the vicar's wife supervised the arrangement of donation boxes decorated with miniature nutcrackers. It was then that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the magnificent display dominating the centre of the lobby. A collection of antique nutcrackers, some nearly 3 feet tall, had been arranged on a tiered platform draped in crimson velvet. Each wooden figure held a silver dish filled with sugared almonds, crystallized ginger, and other festive confections, free for guests to sample. The centerpiece was a particularly splendid specimen, painted in rich blues and golds, its mouth open in the traditional fierce grimace. Lady Pemberton swept through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. As the Academy's primary benefactor and chair of its board, she commanded respect, though Miss Marple had observed that this respect was often tinged with something less pleasant. The lady's reputation for exacting standards and ruthless decision-making preceded her like a bitter perfume. Miss Marple watched as Lady Pemberton paused at the Nutcracker display, selecting several sugared almonds from the central figure's dish with deliberate care. She consumed them with evident satisfaction, while surveying the crowd like a general inspecting troops. Her gaze lingered particularly on a group of young dancers warming up near the stage door, their faces bright with nervous excitement. Among them stood Emma Winters, a girl of perhaps 17, whose natural grace marked her as exceptional even in such talented company. Miss Marple had heard of Emma's recent departure from the Academy, allegedly due to her family's inability to continue paying fees despite her scholarship. The girl's presence tonight as a volunteer usher rather than a performer seemed a particular cruelty. The 5-minute bell chimed, and guests began moving toward the auditorium. Miss Marple noticed Lady Pemberton returning to the Nutcracker display for another handful of almonds, which she wrapped in a handkerchief before proceeding to her box. As the crowd filtered past, several other guests helped themselves to the confections, though none with Lady Pemberton's particular attention to selection. The performance began magnificently, with the Academy's students bringing Tchaikovsky's beloved score to life through their precise movements and youthful enthusiasm. Miss Marple found herself transported by the familiar story of Clara and her magical Christmas Eve, though she couldn't help noticing the empty space in the corps de ballet where Emma Winters should have been performing. It was during the second act's grand pas de deux that the first indication of trouble emerged. From Lady Pemberton's box came a sound that was neither applause nor appreciation, but something far more disturbing. A strangled gasp, followed by the crash of opera glasses hitting the floor. The dancers continued their performance, unaware of the drama unfolding above them, but Miss Marple was already rising from her seat, her instincts alert to disaster. By the time the house lights came up and the awful truth became apparent, Lady Pemberton was beyond help, her face contorted in an expression that bore an unsettling resemblance to the Nutcracker's painted grimace, and the faint, unmistakable scent of bitter almonds hanging in the air around her still form. Chapter 2. The Scholarship Fund's Secret Ledger. The theatre had transformed from a place of Christmas magic into a crime scene with alarming swiftness. Police constables cordoned off Lady Pemberton's box, while Inspector Craddock established a temporary headquarters in the theatre manager's office. The audience, initially shocked into silence, now hummed with nervous speculation as they waited to give their statements. Miss Marple found herself in the unique position of being both witness and unofficial consultant, a role Inspector Craddock had learned to value despite his initial scepticism. She sat in the green room among the young dancers still in their Nutcracker costumes, their stage makeup now streaked with tears of shock and confusion. The door opened to admit Dr. Haydock, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave. He had been in the audience when Lady Pemberton collapsed and had rushed to provide assistance, though it had been immediately apparent that no medical intervention could help her. Strychnine poisoning, he confirmed quietly to Inspector Craddock, though loudly enough for Miss Marple's keen ears to catch. The symptoms are unmistakable. The muscular convulsions, the risus sardonicus, that characteristic facial expression. Death would have occurred within 15 to 30 minutes of ingestion. Miss Marple reflected on the timeline. Lady Pemberton had consumed the sugared almonds just before the performance began at 8 o'clock. The first act had run for 45 minutes, and she had collapsed during the second act's opening. The poisoned confections must have been specifically targeted, as no other guests who had sampled from the Nutcracker display showed any signs of distress. Inspector Craddock began his methodical questioning of the theatre staff and performers. The Nutcracker display had been assembled that afternoon under the supervision of Mrs. Hadley, the Academy's administrative secretary. The antique figures belonged to the Academy's collection, donated over the years by various patrons. The sugared almonds and other treats had been prepared by Pemberton's Confectionery, the high street shop that, despite its name, had no connection to Lady Pemberton's family. It was during the questioning of Mrs. Hadley that the first peculiarity emerged. The woman, normally composed and efficient, seemed unusually flustered when asked about the scholarship fund that tonight's gala was meant to support. Her hands trembled as she produced a leather-bound ledger from her briefcase. "The fund has been operating for 15 years, she explained, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Lady Pemberton managed it personally, reviewing every application and making all final decisions about awards. We typically support 5 to 6 students each year, covering their full tuition and expenses." Miss Marple, who had been examining the ledger while Mrs. Hadley spoke, noticed something odd about the entries. The handwriting changed subtly but distinctly about 6 months ago, and several pages showed evidence of erasure and overwriting. More curious still, the amounts recorded for recent scholarship disbursements didn't match the bank statements tucked into the ledger's back pocket. "Mrs. Hadley," Miss Marple inquired gently, "who besides Lady Pemberton had access to the scholarship fund accounts?" "Only Lady Pemberton and myself, as secretary. But all transactions required her signature. I merely maintained the records and processed the paperwork she approved. Yet Emma Winters, one of your most talented students, was forced to leave the Academy due to lack of funds despite being a scholarship recipient," Miss Marple observed. "How do you account for that?" Mrs. Hadley's complexion paled noticeably. Lady Pemberton reviewed Emma's case personally. She determined that the girl's family income had increased sufficiently to disqualify her from continued support. It was terribly unfortunate, but the fund's resources are limited, and we must follow strict guidelines. Inspector Craddock leaned forward with interest. "And where are these? Guidelines documented, Mrs. Hadley?" The secretary fumbled through her briefcase, producing several folders but failing to locate the requested document. They must be in Lady Pemberton's private files at her home. She always kept the most sensitive documents there for security purposes. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Craddock. The absence of crucial documentation, combined with the altered ledger entries, suggested that someone had been manipulating the scholarship fund for their own purposes. But was that someone Lady Pemberton herself, or had she discovered another's malfeasance? The questioning was interrupted by a young constable who entered carrying an evidence bag containing several sugared almonds from the Nutcracker display. "Initial testing shows strychnine concentrated in the almonds from the central Nutcracker only, sir. The others appear clean. Whoever did this knew exactly which dish Lady Pemberton would choose from." "Which suggests," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "intimate knowledge of Lady Pemberton's habits and preferences. someone who had observed her closely, perhaps for quite some time, planning this moment with meticulous care. Chapter 3. Dancing Shadows in the Wings. The investigation had moved to the academy itself, a Georgian building adjacent to the theatre that housed practice studios and administrative offices. Inspector Craddock had commandeered the main studio, its mirrored walls reflecting the unusual gathering of suspects and witnesses in infinite repetition. The bars along the walls, normally used for ballet exercises, now served as makeshift seating for those waiting to be questioned. Miss Marple positioned herself near the piano, where she could observe everyone while appearing to merely rest. The assembled group represented a cross-section of the academy's community: instructors, students, parents, and administrative staff. Among them, Emma Winters stood apart, her volunteer usher's badge still pinned to her simple black dress, a stark contrast to the elaborate costumes worn by the performing students. Inspector Craddock called Emma forward for questioning, his manner professional but not unkind. The girl moved with the unconscious grace that marked her as a true dancer, though Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor in her hands. "Miss Winters," the inspector began, "I understand you were a scholarship student here until recently. Can you explain the circumstances of your departure?" Emma's voice was steady despite her obvious distress. "I received a letter 6 months ago stating that my scholarship had been terminated due to changes in my family's financial situation. But nothing had changed, Inspector. My father still works at the postal office my mother takes in sewing. We could never afford the fees without assistance." "Did you appeal the decision?" "I tried. I wrote to Lady Pemberton directly, even attempted to meet with her personally. She refused to see me. Mrs. Hadley said the decision was final and suggested I might reapply the following year if our circumstances worsened sufficiently." Miss Marple interjected gently, "Yet you continued to volunteer at academy events, including tonight's gala. Why?" Emma's composure cracked slightly. "Because I love to dance. Even if I can't take classes, being near the academy, helping in any way, it's better than nothing. And I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that if Lady Pemberton saw my dedication, she might reconsider." The questioning continued with other students, each providing fragments of information that gradually assembled into a troubling picture. Several mentioned that scholarship students had been leaving at an unusual rate over the past year, always with the same explanation about changed financial circumstances. The remaining scholarship recipients seemed nervous, fearful that they might be next. It was during the testimony of Mr. Petrova, the Academy's senior ballet master, that a new dimension emerged. The elderly Russian émigré, his accent still pronounced after 40 years in England, spoke with evident reluctance. Lady Pemberton, she was not the woman she once was, he said, choosing his words carefully. 6 months ago, maybe more, she began to change, more suspicious, more secretive. She would arrive at odd hours, reviewing financial records, making telephone calls behind closed doors. She dismissed our concerns about losing talented students, said the academy must be run like business, not charity. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Hadley shifting uncomfortably during this testimony. The secretary's fingers worried at the corner of her notebook, a nervous habit that suggested considerable anxiety. Mr. Petrova continued, and there was the matter of the Christmas gala funds. Each year, we raise £30,000 to £40,000. This money should support 10, maybe 12 students. But this year, Lady Pemberton announced we could only support 4. Where does the rest go? We are not told. Inspector Craddock consulted his notes. According to the financial records provided, the fund's expenditures match its income. Every pound is accounted for. On paper, yes, Mr. Petrova agreed, his tone sceptical. But paper can lie, Inspector. In my homeland, we learned this well. The official truth and the real truth, they are often strangers to each other. The observation prompted Miss Marple to consider the altered ledger entries she had noticed earlier. Someone had indeed been creating an official truth that diverged significantly from reality. But was Lady Pemberton the architect of this deception, or had she perhaps discovered it and paid the ultimate price for that knowledge? The investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Constable Morrison, who entered carrying a small wooden box wrapped in an evidence bag. Found this in Lady Pemberton's private office, sir. Hidden behind the portrait of her late husband. Contains what appears to be a second set of books for the scholarship fund. Inspector Craddock examined the documents with growing amazement. These records showed substantial discrepancies with the official ledger, with large sums of money seemingly vanishing into thin air. More damning still, the entries were in Lady Pemberton's own hand, dated over the past 6 months. It appears, the inspector said grimly, that Lady Pemberton was embezzling from the very fund she was supposed to protect. These students lost their scholarships not due to changed circumstances, but to fund her own purposes. But Miss Marple was studying the hidden ledger with a different perspective, her keen eyes noting details others might overlook. The ink, though apparently consistent, showed subtle variations in colour that suggested different pens used at different times. More telling still, certain numerical figures were formed with a continental style, quite unlike Lady Pemberton's usual notation. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we may be looking at this backwards. What if Lady Pemberton didn't create these false records, but discovered them? What if her secretive behaviour these past months was not guilt, but investigation?" Chapter 4. The Broken Point Shoes Message. The morning following Lady Pemberton's death brought a crystalline clarity to St. Mary Mead, with frost painting delicate patterns on windows and a pale winter sun illuminating the village in sharp relief. Miss Marple arrived at the police station to find Inspector Craddock examining an unusual piece of evidence that had been discovered during the overnight search of the academy. It was a point shoe, worn and carefully darned, found hidden in the costume storage room behind a rack of tutus. What made it remarkable was not its presence. Dancers often kept old shoes as mementos, but rather the message written in tiny, precise script along its inner sole. She knows. December 21st. The performance. God forgive me. The date was today's, the day of the fatal gala. The handwriting, though cramped by the confined space, was distinctive enough for identification. Mrs. Hadley had already confirmed it belonged to Emma Winters, though the girl herself had yet to be questioned about this discovery. Miss Marple examined the shoe with careful attention, noting the quality of the darning and the particular wear pattern that spoke of countless hours of practice. This was not merely a shoe, but a testament to dedication and dreams, now transformed into potential evidence of premeditation. Emma arrived accompanied by her parents, their faces drawn with worry. The girl's composure from the previous evening had given way to visible exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes suggesting a sleepless night. When shown the point shoe, her reaction was immediate and surprising. "I wrote that message 3 days ago," she admitted without hesitation. "But not about Lady Pemberton. It was about Mrs. Hadley. I discovered something, and I thought she knew that I knew." Inspector Craddock leaned forward intently. "What did you discover, Miss Winters?" Emma glanced at her parents before continuing. "I've been volunteering in the office, helping with filing and correspondence. Last week I was organising old scholarship applications when I found my own file. It contained a letter from a private benefactor, someone who had specifically designated funds for my continued education. The letter was dated just 2 months ago, well after my scholarship was terminated." Miss Marple felt the familiar sensation of pieces falling into place. This benefactor, did they give their name? Only initials, M.R. But there was a note attached in Lady Pemberton's handwriting that said, "Verify with bank before processing." That note was dated the same day I received my termination letter. The implications were clear. Someone had intercepted the designated donation and used Lady Pemberton's supposed financial review as cover for denying Emma her scholarship. But who had both the access and the audacity to perpetrate such a deception? Mrs. Hadley was summoned for additional questioning, arriving in a state of barely controlled agitation. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of distress. A missed button on her cardigan, a slight run in her stockings, trembling hands that she couldn't quite still. "Mrs. Hadley," Inspector Craddock began, "we've discovered evidence that funds designated for specific students were diverted. As secretary, you had primary access to incoming correspondence and donation processing. Can you explain these discrepancies?" The woman's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "My son, Timothy, he's at medical school. The fees, the living expenses, it was crushing us. I only meant to borrow small amounts just until he graduated. I kept careful records, intending to pay everything back." Miss Marple observed the woman's anguish with compassion tempered by the gravity of her confession. "So you created false entries showing changed financial circumstances for scholarship students, allowing you to redirect their funds?" Mrs. Hadley nodded miserably. "It started with just one student who had family abroad. I thought no one would notice. But Lady Pemberton, she was sharper than I realized. 6 months ago, she began requesting original documents, cross-checking bank statements, asking questions I couldn't answer satisfactorily. And the second set of books found in her office. I created those to throw her off the trail, make it appear that she herself was embezzling. I planted them 3 days ago during the gala preparations, hoping to deflect suspicion if she made her discoveries public. But I would never have harmed her physically. You must believe me." Miss Marple studied the secretary's desperate expression. The woman was clearly guilty of embezzlement, but was she also guilty of murder? The poisoned almonds suggested a different kind of planning. Someone who knew Lady Pemberton's habits intimately and could predict her behaviour with certainty. "Mrs. Hadley," Miss Marple asked gently, "who knew that Lady Pemberton always selected almonds from the central Nutcracker at these events?" Everyone at the Academy knew. It was something of a joke among the staff. "She said that particular Nutcracker reminded her of her late husband, stern but protective. She always chose from his dish first, said it brought her luck." The inspector and Miss Marple exchanged glances. If this habit was common knowledge, then virtually anyone connected to the Academy could have planned the poisoning. The field of suspects, rather than narrowing, had suddenly expanded dramatically. It was then that Constable Morrison entered with news that would shift the investigation's focus entirely. "Sir, we found something in the confectionery shop's records. 3 days ago, someone placed a special order for sugared almonds with specific instructions for preparation and delivery. The order was paid in cash, but the shop owner remembers the customer clearly." Chapter 5. Footlights revealing hidden tears. The confectionery shop on the high street retained the Victorian charm that made it a favourite among locals and tourists alike. Behind its bow windows, displays of handmade chocolates and traditional sweets created a festive atmosphere that seemed at odds with the grim purpose of the police visit. Mr. Pemberton, the proprietor and a third cousin to Lady Pemberton's late husband, greeted them with obvious nervousness. Inspector Craddock got straight to the point. "Mr. Pemberton, we need information about the special order placed 3 days ago for sugared almonds delivered to the theatre." The elderly confectioner consulted his order book with trembling fingers. "Yes, here it is. 3 pounds of sugared almonds to be prepared separately from our regular stock and delivered directly to the theatre on the morning of the gala. Paid in cash, £20. Can you describe the customer?" Mr. Pemberton hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It was someone I knew, Inspector, which is why I remember so clearly. Young Daniel Morrison, the chemist's assistant. He said he was placing the order on behalf of the Academy, for Lady Pemberton specifically. She wanted them prepared in a particular way, with extra sugar coating to make them more festive." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Daniel Morrison was a name that hadn't previously emerged in the investigation. A young man of perhaps 22, he had worked at the local pharmacy for 3 years, and was known to be studying for his pharmaceutical examinations in the evenings. Did Mr. Morrison give any reason for the separate preparation? He said Lady Pemberton was particular about contamination, wanted them kept apart from anything containing nuts, due to potential allergies among the young dancers. It seemed reasonable at the time. The investigation moved swiftly to the pharmacy, where Daniel Morrison was found in the dispensary, carefully measuring medications with the precision his profession demanded. When confronted with Mr. Pemberton's testimony, his reaction was one of genuine bewilderment. "I never placed any such order," he protested. 3 days ago, I was in London for my examinations. I have the train tickets, the examination board's confirmation. My landlady can verify I stayed overnight." Inspector Craddock examined the documentation Daniel produced, all of which appeared genuine. "Someone impersonated you then, Mr. Morrison?" Who would know enough about you to do so convincingly? Daniel considered this carefully. Well, anyone local would know I work here. As for my examination schedule, I mentioned it to several people. Mrs. Hadley knew. She asked me to pick up Lady Pemberton's heart medication while I was in London. Emma Winters knew. We sometimes talk when she passes the shop. Even Lady Pemberton herself knew. She congratulated me on pursuing my qualification just last week. Miss Marple had been examining the pharmacy's poison register, a legal requirement for all establishments handling dangerous substances. Mr. Morrison, I notice here that strychnine was dispensed 2 weeks ago for pest control. Who authorised that purchase? That was for Mr. Harborough at Mill Farm. Rat problems in his grain stores. Everything was properly documented and signed for. Yet strychnine was also found in Lady Pemberton's system. Can you account for your entire supply? Daniel moved to the locked cabinet where controlled substances were stored. He performed a quick inventory, his face paling as he completed the count. We're missing approximately 50 grams, enough for several lethal doses. But that's impossible. Only Mr. Hartley, the pharmacist, and I have keys to this cabinet. The mystery deepened when Mr. Hartley, summoned from his day off, confirmed that his keys had never left his possession. The lock showed no signs of tampering, and the security measures appeared intact. Someone with considerable knowledge had accessed the poison without leaving a trace. It was then that Miss Marple noticed something peculiar about the dispensing records. The handwriting in recent entries showed subtle variations, as if someone had been practicing copying the legitimate style. She pointed this out to Inspector Craddock, who immediately recognized the implications. Someone has been studying these records, learning to forge entries, Miss Marple observed. This suggests prolonged access and careful planning. Our poisoner didn't act on impulse, but prepared methodically over weeks or perhaps months. The investigation returned to the academy, where students and staff were rehearsing for the Christmas Eve performance, attempting to maintain normality despite the tragedy. In the rehearsal studio, Emma Winters was coaching younger students, having volunteered to help despite her own exclusion from performing. Watching her patient instruction and gentle encouragement, Miss Marple was struck by the girls' genuine love for dance and teaching. It seemed impossible that someone so dedicated to nurturing young talent could harbour the coldness required for calculated murder. Yet as Miss Marple observed more carefully, she noticed something that others had overlooked. Emma's movements, while graceful, showed a slight favouring of her right ankle. When asked about it, the girl's response was revealing. An old injury from 6 months ago, just after my scholarship was terminated. I couldn't afford proper physiotherapy, so it never healed quite right. It's why, even if my scholarship were reinstated now, I could never dance professionally. That dream is over. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, a deep wound that went beyond financial hardship to the destruction of everything she had worked toward. Here was a motive more powerful than money, the theft of a future, the crushing of a dream that could never be recovered. Chapter 6. The Sugar Plum Fairy's Last Secret. Lady Pemberton's private residence yielded secrets like a tree shedding leaves in autumn. The Georgian townhouse, decorated for Christmas with understated elegance, seemed to mourn its mistress's absence. Inspector Craddock had obtained a warrant for a thorough search, and Miss Marple accompanied him, her keen eyes often noticing what official investigation might overlook. The study proved most revealing. Behind false panels in Lady Pemberton's desk, they discovered correspondence dating back 8 months, detailing her growing suspicions about the scholarship fund's irregularities. She had hired a private investigator, whose reports painted a damning picture of systematic embezzlement stretching back nearly 2 years. She knew about Mrs. Hadley's theft much earlier than we thought, Inspector Craddock observed, studying the investigator's reports, yet she didn't act immediately. Why wait? Miss Marple examined a half-finished letter on the desk, dated the day before the gala. Lady Pemberton had been writing to the Academy's Board of Trustees, but the letter broke off mid-sentence. The evidence I have gathered proves conclusively that the theft involves not just Mrs. Hadley, but also... The sentence remained forever unfinished, its revelation dying with its author. Yet among the papers was a photograph that provided a potential answer. It showed the Academy's end-of-year celebration from 6 months prior. Lady Pemberton stood with various staff members, but someone had drawn a circle around two figures standing together in the background, Mrs. Hadley and Mr. Petrova, the ballet master. Miss Marple studied the photograph with interest. They appeared to be in intense conversation, Mrs. Hadley passing what looked like an envelope to the elderly instructor. The image quality made details difficult to discern, but the secretive nature of their interaction was unmistakable. The investigation shifted to Mr. Petrova's modest flat above the academy. The elderly ballet master received them with old-world courtesy, though his hands trembled, as he poured tea from a samovar that had travelled with him from Russia decades ago. Inspector Craddock presented the photograph without preamble. "Mr. Petrova, can you explain this interaction with Mrs. Hadley?" The old man's shoulders sagged with the weight of confession. "You understand, Inspector, I am 73 years old. In Russia, I was principal dancer at the Mariinsky. Here, I teach children their first positions. My pension is nothing, my savings depleted by medical expenses. When Mrs. Hadley offered me a way to supplement my income, I was weak. What did she offer? To share the funds she was taking, if I helped identify which students could be dismissed without causing suspicion. Students with family abroad, those with minor disciplinary issues, anyone whose removal could be explained away. I provided the cover stories while she managed the finances." Miss Marple observed the man's genuine remorse. "And Emma Winters?" Petrova's voice cracked with emotion. "Emma was special, a talent that appears once in a generation. I fought to keep her, but Mrs. Hadley insisted. She said Emma's benefactor had provided too much money to ignore. We quarrelled terribly about it. I threatened to confess everything to Lady Pemberton. When was this threat made? 3 days before the gala. Mrs. Hadley became desperate, said she would find another way to handle the situation. I thought she meant she would return the money. I never imagined." The confession was interrupted by the arrival of Constable Morrison with urgent news. The laboratory had completed its analysis of the poisoned almonds. The strychnine had been skillfully incorporated into the sugar coating, requiring knowledge of both chemistry and confectionery techniques. More significantly, traces of a specific crystallizing agent used only in professional sweet-making had been detected. "This agent," Miss Marple inquired, "would it be available at the pharmacy?" The constable consulted his notes. "No, ma'am. It's only available from specialist suppliers. The only local source would be the confectionery shop itself." The implications were clear. The poisoner had not only accessed strychnine, but also possessed the technical knowledge to incorporate it undetectably into confections. This suggested someone with training in both pharmaceutical and culinary arts, a combination that significantly narrowed the suspect pool. Inspector Craddock reviewed his notes with growing frustration. "We have multiple people with motive. Mrs. Hadley faced exposure and ruin. Mr. Petrova feared disgrace. Emma Winters lost her future. Yet none perfectly fits the technical requirements for creating the poisoned almonds." Miss Marple had been quietly observing a collection of photographs on Petrova's mantelpiece. One showed a younger Petrova with a beautiful woman in ballet costume. "My wife, Natasha," the old man explained. "She died 10 years ago. Cancer. The treatments bankrupted us, but I would have sold my soul to save her." Another photograph caught Miss Marple's attention. It showed Petrova with a young man who bore a striking resemblance to the ballet master. This young man had his arm around Emma Winters, both smiling at what appeared to be a competition where Emma had won first place. "Your son?" Miss Marple asked gently. "My nephew, Alexei. He lives in London now, works as a pastry chef at the Savoy. He trained both in cooking and chemistry before choosing his profession. He and Emma were, how do you say, sweethearts before she lost her scholarship. The distance and her depression ended their relationship." Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock exchanged meaningful glances. Here was someone with both the technical knowledge and emotional motivation for murder. A pastry chef would understand crystallizing agents, while chemical training would provide knowledge of poisons. "When did your nephew last visit St. Mary Mead?" Petrova's answer came slowly, as if he suddenly understood the implications. "He came for my birthday last week. Stayed 3 days. He was terribly upset about Emma, said those responsible for destroying her dreams deserved punishment. But Alexei would never. He's a good boy, gentle and kind. Yet sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, it was precisely the gentle and kind who committed the most desperate acts when someone they loved was wronged beyond endurance. Chapter 7. The Understudy's Hidden Performance. The Savoy Hotel's kitchens operated with the precision of a ballet company, each chef moving in practiced synchronization to create culinary masterpieces. Alexei Petrova worked at the pastry station, his hands steady as he piped delicate rosettes onto a Charlotte Russe. When Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple arrived with their questions, he showed no surprise, as if he had been expecting them. The head chef granted them use of a private dining room for the interview. Alexei entered, still wearing his whites, flour dusting his dark hair that bore such striking resemblance to his uncle's. He carried himself with the same elegant posture, though his movements spoke of kitchen precision rather than stage presence. "Mr. Petrova," Inspector Craddock began, "we need to discuss your recent visit to St. Mary Mead and your relationship with Emma Winters." Alexei's composure remained intact. "Emma and I were together for 2 years. I loved her. Still love her, if I'm honest. Watching her dreams destroyed by Lady Pemberton's greed was unbearable." "Lady Pemberton's greed? What makes you use that term?" The young man's eyes flashed with anger. "My uncle told me about the embezzlement weeks ago, though he didn't know I overheard his conversation with Mrs. Hadley. I knew they were stealing, but I also knew Lady Pemberton was the real architect. She controlled everything at that academy with an iron fist. Nothing happened without her knowledge." Miss Marple interjected gently. "Yet, our investigation suggests Lady Pemberton was actually uncovering the embezzlement, not perpetrating it." Alexei laughed bitterly. "Is that the story they're spinning? Lady Pemberton was no innocent victim. She discovered the theft and used it for leverage, blackmailing Mrs. Hadley and my uncle into doing her dirty work while she kept the lion's share. Why else would she let it continue for so long? The theory was not without merit, though it contradicted the evidence they had gathered." Miss Marple studied the young man's face, noting the genuine conviction behind his words. He truly believed Lady Pemberton was the mastermind, which raised troubling questions about who had led him to this conclusion. "Mr. Petrova, did you place an order at Pemberton's confectionery 3 days ago?" He hesitated just a fraction too long. "No, I was here in London working a double shift. You can verify with my supervisor." Indeed, the supervisor confirmed Alexei's presence, though he noted the young chef had taken an extended break in the afternoon, claiming illness. 3 hours unaccounted for, just enough time to travel to St. Mary Mead and back by express train. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a search of Alexei's locker revealed a small bottle of crystallizing agent, the same type detected in the poisoned almonds. When confronted with this evidence, his demeanor shifted from defiance to resignation. "I took it from here to practice making special confections for Emma. Christmas presents to cheer her up. I've been experimenting with new techniques, trying to create something beautiful enough to make her smile again." Inspector Craddock remained skeptical. "And the strychnine? Did you also acquire that for innocent purposes?" Alexei's silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple observed the war of emotions playing across his features: protective love, bitter anger, and something else, a deep sadness that suggested knowledge he wished he didn't possess. The questioning was interrupted by an urgent telephone call. Mrs. Hadley had attempted suicide, consuming a large quantity of sleeping tablets. She had been rushed to hospital, and while expected to survive, had left a confession note that Inspector Craddock read aloud. "I killed Lady Pemberton. The guilt of my theft, the fear of exposure, the certainty of ruin drove me to madness. I placed strychnine in the almonds, knowing her habits, ensuring she would be the only victim. I cannot live with what I've done. Tell Emma Winters I'm sorry for destroying her dreams. Tell everyone I'm sorry." The confession seemed to resolve the case, yet Miss Marple noticed Alexei's reaction was not relief but confusion. If he had been planning his own revenge, Mrs. Hadley's confession should have surprised him. Instead, he appeared puzzled, as if pieces weren't fitting as expected. "She's lying," he said suddenly. "Mrs. Hadley didn't do it. She couldn't have. 3 days ago, she was at the academy all day, running rehearsals. I know because Emma told me. They were together from morning until evening, preparing for the gala." Inspector Craddock, frowned. Then why would she confess to a crime she didn't commit? Miss Marple had been considering this very question. In her experience, false confessions arose from three sources: protecting someone else, avoiding a worse truth, or being manipulated into believing one's own guilt. Given Mrs. Hadley's emotional state and the pressure she'd been under, any of these seemed possible. The investigation had reached a crucial juncture. They had a confession, but it contradicted known facts. They had multiple suspects with means and motive, yet none whose guilt was certain. And somewhere in the tangle of lies, embezzlement, and destroyed dreams lay the truth about who had really murdered Lady Pemberton. "Mr. Petrova," Miss Marple asked carefully, "who besides Emma told you about Lady Pemberton's supposed involvement in the embezzlement?" Alexi's answer would prove to be the key that unlocked the entire mystery. There was someone else, someone who claimed to have inside knowledge of Lady Pemberton's crimes, someone who promised that justice would be served if I just remained patient. "Who?" Inspector Craddock demanded. "Daniel Morrison, the chemist's assistant. He said he had been gathering evidence for months, that Lady Pemberton had destroyed his sister's dancing career years ago through similar schemes. He promised that she would pay for all the dreams she had crushed." Chapter 8. Stage directions written in poison. Daniel Morrison's second interrogation took place in the harsh fluorescent light of the police station's interview room. Gone was the confused young pharmacy assistant protesting his innocence. In his place sat someone whose calm demeanour suggested careful preparation for this moment. His solicitor, hastily summoned from London, sat beside him with a folder of documents. "Before you begin, Inspector," Daniel said with surprising composure, "there are things you need to know about my family's history with Lady Pemberton. My sister Sarah was a student at the Academy 12 years ago. She was brilliant, destined for the Royal Ballet. Then Lady Pemberton accused her of stealing from the costume fund. No evidence, just her word against a scholarship student. Sarah's career was destroyed overnight." Miss Marple studied the young man's face, noting the controlled anger that simmered beneath his professional exterior. "And you've harboured this resentment for 12 years? Not harboured, cultivated. I've spent years documenting Lady Pemberton's destruction of young dancers' lives. Always the scholarship students, always those without connections to fight back. She would manufacture scandals, create financial crises, destroy dreams for sport." Inspector Craddock examined the documents Daniel's solicitor provided. They detailed numerous cases over the past 15 years, where promising students had been suddenly expelled or had their scholarships terminated under questionable circumstances. The pattern was undeniable, though whether Lady Pemberton or Mrs. Hadley was responsible remained unclear. "Even if these allegations are true," Craddock said, "they don't give you the right to commit murder." Daniel's composure cracked slightly. "I didn't kill her, though God knows I wanted to. When I discovered the embezzlement scheme, I thought I finally had the evidence to destroy her legitimately. I shared my suspicions with others who had been wronged, thinking we could build a legal case together, including Alexei Petrova. Yes, his rage over Emma matched mine over Sarah. We talked about justice, about ensuring Lady Pemberton faced consequences, but it was all talk, at least on my part. I never acquired strychnine, never impersonated myself at the confectionery. Someone used my name, my reputation, to frame me." Miss Marple had been quietly reviewing the pharmacy records Daniel had brought. "Mr. Morrison, these documents show you were researching strychnine's properties weeks before the murder. Why? For my examinations. Toxicology is part of the pharmaceutical curriculum. The research was legitimate, supervised by my professors, but someone knew about it and used that knowledge against me. The investigation had reached an impasse when unexpected evidence arrived. The hospital had pumped Mrs. Hadley's stomach and discovered she had ingested not common sleeping tablets, but a carefully measured dose of barbiturates that would induce unconsciousness without causing death. Her suicide attempt had been theatre, designed to sell her false confession. Furthermore, analysis of her confession note revealed it had been written under duress. Microscopic examination showed hesitation marks, places where the pen had been lifted and replaced, suggesting someone had been dictating or coercing the words. Mrs. Hadley had regained consciousness but remained terrified, refusing to speak beyond repeating her confession. It was clear she feared something or someone more than she feared prison. The question was, who held such power over her? Miss Marple requested permission to visit Mrs. Hadley alone. The woman lay pale against the hospital pillows, her eyes darting nervously to the door every few seconds. When Miss Marple sat beside her bed and took her hand gently, tears began flowing down the secretary's cheeks. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "you didn't kill Lady Pemberton. We both know this. But someone has convinced you to take the blame. Who are you protecting?" Mrs. Hadley's response came in barely a whisper. "They said if I didn't confess, they would destroy my son's medical career, plant evidence that he had been stealing drugs from the teaching hospital. He's so close to graduating, I couldn't let them ruin him too." "Who threatened you?" "I don't know." The voice on the telephone was disguised. They knew everything about the embezzlement, about Mr. Petrova's involvement, about my son. They said Lady Pemberton's death was justice, but someone had to pay the official price. If I confessed, my son would be protected, and the stolen money would be quietly returned to the academy. Miss Marple felt the familiar sensation of revelation approaching. The murderer wasn't just seeking revenge, but orchestrating an elaborate performance where each participant played an assigned role. The question remained, who was the director of this deadly production? The answer came from an unexpected source. Emma Winters arrived at the police station with evidence she had discovered while cleaning the academy's prop room. It was a collection of papers hidden inside an old Nutcracker costume, documents that revealed the true extent of the conspiracy and the identity of the person orchestrating events from the shadows. The papers included detailed surveillance notes on Lady Pemberton's movements, analysis of her habits, chemical formulas for incorporating strychnine into sugar coating, and most damning, a schedule for the gala evening that precisely predicted when and how the murder would occur. The handwriting was distinctive, belonging to someone who had been present throughout the investigation, but never seriously suspected. It was then that Miss Marple realized the truth. The murderer had been performing their own role so convincingly that everyone, including herself, had been misdirected. Like the Nutcracker ballet itself, where nothing was quite as it seemed and magic transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary, this crime had been a masterpiece of misdirection. Chapter 9. The final curtain falls at midnight. The assembly in the theatre's auditorium that evening was a mirror image of the fatal gala, though the atmosphere was one of tense expectation rather than festive celebration. Inspector Craddock had gathered all the principals: Daniel Morrison, Alexei Petrova, Mrs. Hadley, released from hospital under police guard, Mr. Petrova, Emma Winters, and surprisingly Mr. Pemberton from the confectionery shop. Miss Marple stood on the stage where the tragedy had begun, the restored Nutcracker display behind her. The antique figures seemed to watch with painted eyes as she prepared to unravel the truth of Lady Pemberton's murder. "The solution to this tragedy," she began, "lies not in the embezzlement that provided motive for so many, but in understanding who truly orchestrated these events. We've been watching a performance where the murderer cast each of you in specific roles, manipulating your actions to achieve their deadly purpose." She moved to the central Nutcracker, the one that had held the poisoned almonds. This particular figure belonged to Lady Pemberton's personal collection. She donated it to the Academy 5 years ago, but few knew its special significance. It was a gift from her husband on their last Christmas together before his death. She always chose from this Nutcracker first, a private ritual of remembrance. The assembled group shifted uneasily, each wondering where this revelation would lead. The murderer knew this intimate detail, just as they knew about the embezzlement, about each person's vulnerabilities and secrets. They had access to both the pharmacy and the confectionery, knowledge of chemistry and performance, the ability to move freely without suspicion. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a figure who had remained quiet throughout the investigation, helpful when asked but never volunteering information. "Mr. Pemberton," she said gently, "you weren't just Lady Pemberton's distant cousin by marriage. You were her husband's closest confidant, weren't you?" The elderly confectioner's face had gone pale. "We were like brothers. Harold told me everything, including his concerns about his wife's treatment of scholarship students. And after his death, you continued visiting the academy, bringing treats for the students, maintaining a presence in your cousin's memory. You had keys to the building, knew everyone's schedules, overheard conversations. You discovered the embezzlement not through investigation, but through patient observation. Pemberton's hands trembled as he spoke. Lydia destroyed everything Harold had tried to build. The academy was meant to nurture talent regardless of background, but she turned it into a tool for social climbing, discarding anyone who didn't fit her vision. So you decided to deliver justice in the most poetic way possible, Miss Marple continued, using the Nutcracker theme, the very ballet that represented the Academy's charitable mission. You prepared the poisoned almonds in your own workshop, where you had both the materials and expertise. You created the false order supposedly from Daniel Morrison, knowing his pharmaceutical knowledge would make him a plausible suspect. The confession came slowly, like a dam breaking under pressure. Pemberton's voice grew stronger as he unburdened himself. I watched Emma Winters that night 6 months ago when she learned about her scholarship. The devastation on her face, it was Sarah Morrison all over again, and countless others. I knew then that Lydia had to be stopped. When I discovered Mrs. Hadley's embezzlement, I saw an opportunity to ensure she faced justice while protecting the innocent victims of her schemes. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. You manipulated everyone, Alexei Petrova, Daniel Morrison, even Mrs. Hadley, into playing their parts. I gave them the rope, Pemberton replied. They chose what to do with it. Mrs. Hadley's embezzlement was real. The young men's anger was genuine. I merely ensured that when Lydia died, there would be so many suspects with motive that the truth would be obscured. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. But you couldn't resist the theatrical element. The Nutcracker, the Christmas setting, the bitter almonds recalling the marzipan from the ballet. It was all too perfectly staged, too poetic for a crime of simple passion or greed. Pemberton stood slowly, age showing in every movement. Harold would have hated what I've done, but seeing those children's dreams destroyed year after year, watching Lydia profit from their pain, I couldn't stand by any longer. The embezzled money has been returned to the Academy anonymously. Emma and the other wronged students will have their scholarships restored. At least some good has come from this tragedy. As Inspector Craddock formally arrested him, Pemberton turned to Emma Winters. Dance, my dear. Dance for all of us who can only watch and dream. The truth revealed, the assembly dispersed into the winter night. The Academy would continue, purged of its corruption. The students would dance again, their dreams protected by new safeguards and transparency. But the cost of justice had been high, measured in one life taken and another destroyed by the taking. Miss Marple remained on the stage after the others had gone, contemplating the Nutcracker figures. In trying to protect innocence, Pemberton had sacrificed his own. The very qualities that made him care enough to act, his loyalty to his cousin's memory, his empathy for the students, had led him to commit the ultimate crime. Chapter 10. New snow on Christmas morning. Christmas morning brought fresh snow to St. Mary Mead, covering the village in a pristine blanket that seemed to offer the promise of renewal. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching as families made their way to church, their footprints creating new paths through the white landscape. The events at the Academy had concluded just 3 days prior, but already the village was attempting to return to its normal rhythms. The church bells rang out their Christmas celebration as Miss Marple made her way to the morning service. She had received a letter that morning from Emma Winters, written in the careful script of someone choosing their words with deliberation. Dear Miss Marple, Emma had written, the Academy Board has offered to fully restore my scholarship and provide additional funds for physiotherapy. They say with proper treatment, I might dance again, perhaps not professionally, but enough to teach. Mr. Pemberton's solicitor informed me that he left a provision in his will establishing a fund for students like me, those whose dreams were nearly lost. He must have planned this even before everything happened. I don't know how to feel about accepting help that came from such tragedy. Miss Marple had penned her response before leaving for church, encouraging the young woman to accept the opportunity. Grace often emerged from the darkest moments, she had written, and refusing it honoured neither the giver nor those who might benefit from her future teaching. At the church, she encountered Mrs. Bantry, who had been instrumental in organising support for the Academy's reformation. The entire board had resigned, replaced by members committed to transparency and genuine charitable purpose. Mrs. Hadley's son had been allowed to complete his medical degree, the authorities agreeing that he bore no responsibility for his mother's crimes. She would serve a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation in untangling. The full extent of the embezzlement. Mr. Petrova had returned to Russia, his shame too great to remain. He had left his entire savings to the Academy's scholarship fund, a final gesture of repentance. His nephew Alexei had been cleared of all charges and had returned to London, though he maintained correspondence with Emma Winters. Perhaps in time their relationship might rekindle under happier circumstances. Daniel Morrison had emerged from the investigation with his reputation intact, but his faith in justice shaken. He had witnessed how easily truth could be manipulated, how revenge could wear the mask of righteousness. Yet he had also seen justice ultimately prevail, even if its arrival was more complex than he had imagined. He had returned to his studies with a renewed determination, planning to specialize in forensic pharmacy. The Christmas service was particularly poignant that year. The vicar spoke of redemption and forgiveness, of how the Christmas story itself emerged from darkness and danger. Miss Marple noticed several Academy students in attendance, their faces showing a maturity beyond their years. They had witnessed how adult ambitions and failures could destroy innocent dreams, but also how truth, however painful, could ultimately lead to healing. After the service, Miss Marple visited the churchyard, where Lady Pemberton had been buried. The grave was still fresh, marked only by a temporary stone until the permanent memorial could be installed. Someone had left a small poinsettia, its red leaves bright against the snow. There was no card, but Miss Marple suspected it had come from one of the students, perhaps even Emma, acknowledging that Lady Pemberton too had been a victim in this complex tragedy. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Mr. Hartley, the pharmacist who had employed Daniel Morrison, arrived with a Christmas pudding and a request for Miss Marple's perspective on the case. He had been deeply troubled by how his establishment had been unknowingly involved in the murder plot. "What disturbs me most," he confided over tea, "is how Mr. Pemberton used our trust against us. He was a respected member of the community, someone we'd known for decades. How does one guard against such deception without losing faith in everyone?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "One doesn't guard against it, Mr. Hartley. Trust is essential to community life, even knowing it can be betrayed. The alternative, living in constant suspicion, is its own kind of poison. We must simply remain observant, compassionate, and ready to act when truth reveals itself." As evening approached, the Academy held its rescheduled Christmas performance. Miss Marple attended, finding the theatre packed despite the recent tragedy. The students danced with a special poignancy, their performance dedicated to all those whose dreams had been deferred or destroyed. Emma Winters, though not performing, assisted backstage, her presence a symbol of resilience and hope. The Nutcracker was performed in full, its story of transformation and triumph over darkness resonating with particular meaning. When the Sugar Plum Fairy took the stage for her famous variation, the audience observed a moment of silence for Lady Pemberton, acknowledging that she too had once been a young dancer with dreams. The performance concluded with thunderous applause, the community coming together to support the Academy's renewal. As the curtain fell, Miss Marple reflected on the strange parallels between the ballet and recent events. Both featured hidden identities, magical transformations, and battles between good and evil. Both ended with dawn breaking over a changed world. Walking home through the snow-covered streets, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Pemberton's nephew, who had come to settle his uncle's affairs. The young man seemed lost, struggling to reconcile the loving uncle he had known with the murderer revealed by the investigation. "He spoke often of justice in his letters to me," the nephew said. "I thought he meant legal justice, proper investigations and trials. I never imagined he would take matters into his own hands." "Your uncle was a good man who made a terrible choice," Miss Marple replied gently. "He let his desire for justice transform into something darker. But his love for the students, his wish to protect the innocent, that was genuine. Remember that part of him, even as you acknowledge the wrong he did." As midnight approached on Christmas Day, Miss Marple sat in her parlour. contemplating the case that had begun with such festive promise and ended in such complex tragedy. The Nutcracker on her mantelpiece, a simple wooden figure she had owned for years, seemed to regard her with painted eyes that held no judgment, only the patient observation of time passing. She thought of all those touched by the case, Emma beginning her journey back to dance, Daniel pursuing his studies with hard-won wisdom, Alexei creating beautiful confections in London while nursing hopes of reconciliation, Mrs. Hadley facing the consequences of her choices while her son completed his medical training, and Mr. Pemberton spending his first Christmas in custody, paying the price for his vigilante justice. Each had played their role in the tragedy, some willingly, others manipulated into position. Yet from the darkness had come unexpected light, reformed institutions, restored dreams, and a community's renewed commitment to protecting its vulnerable members. The church bells chimed midnight, marking Christmas Day's end. Miss Marple rose to prepare for bed, taking one last look at the peaceful village scene outside her window. The snow continued to fall gently, covering the old footprints and creating a fresh canvas for tomorrow's journeys. In the end, she reflected, justice had been served, though not in the way anyone had anticipated. The academy would continue its mission, now properly supervised and transparently managed. Young dancers would pursue their dreams without fear of arbitrary destruction, and perhaps most importantly, the community had learned to look beyond surface respectability, to recognize the complex moral struggles that could lurk beneath. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Miss Marple offered a quiet prayer for all those affected by the tragedy, including Mr. Pemberton. Christmas was, after all, a season of redemption and hope. Even in the darkest moments, when betrayal and murder shattered the festive peace, the possibility of renewal remained. The Nutcracker's revenge had been complete, but so too was the promise of new beginnings. In the morning, the village would wake to fresh snow and the continuation of life's complex dance between justice and mercy, truth and deception, despair and hope. And Miss Marple would be there, watching with her keen eyes and understanding heart, ready to unravel whatever mysteries the new day might bring. Thank you for joining me tonight, dear listeners. This has been Connor from Velvet Clues, wishing you a Christmas filled with mystery, wonder, and the gentle satisfaction of truth revealed. Until next time, keep observing the world around you. You never know what secrets might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the wisdom to understand their true meaning.